The grand lecture hall at Stanford University was buzzing with anticipation. Rows of students filled every seat. Notebooks and laptops open, ready to absorb the wisdom of one of the most renowned philosophy professors in the country, Professor Daniel Warren. His lectures were not just about teaching philosophy, they were legendary for the intense debates he often sparked. Particularly about religion. A well-known atheist, Professor Warren had built a reputation for dismantling religious arguments with surgical precision. Many students who attempted to challenge him found themselves overwhelmed by his razor-sharp logic and deep knowledge of philosophical doctrines. His lectures often left believers questioning their faith, struggling to answer his relentless questioning, standing confidently at the podium. He let his gaze sweep across the room before speaking. "We live in an age of science and reason," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "And yet, despite all the progress we have made, some still cling to the notion of an invisible creator, a being who supposedly governs the universe. So, let me ask this, can anyone in this room stand up and defend the existence of such a being?" Silence followed. A few students shifted in their seats. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others avoided eye contact altogether. They had seen this scenario before. Students who tried to respond were often quickly outmaneuvered by the professor's logic. But then, slowly, and deliberately, a hand rose from the back of the room. All heads turned. It was Barron, a student known for his quiet demeanor and deep contemplation. He wasn't one to speak much in class, but those who knew him were aware of his strong personal convictions. Unlike others who might hesitate, Barron's expression was calm, his eyes steady. Professor Warren's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Ah, Barron," he said, crossing his arms. "You seem like a man of faith. Tell me, then, if God truly exists, why does he allow suffering? Why do wars, diseases, and injustices persist? If he is all-powerful, why doesn't he stop them?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. It was not just a simple inquiry, it was a direct intellectual challenge. Many before had stumbled over this very question, unable to reconcile the idea of a benevolent, omnipotent God with the harsh realities of the world. But Barron did not flinch. He slowly rose to his feet, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. As he prepared to speak, the class leaned in slightly, sensing that something different was about to happen. Instead of rushing to answer, Barron allowed a brief silence to settle over the room. Then, in a calm and steady voice, he said, "Professor, you are asking the wrong question." A ripple of surprise went through the class. Professor Warren's smile faltered slightly, replaced by mild curiosity. "Oh," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Then what, in your opinion, is the right question?" Barron met his gaze steadily. "The right question isn't why does God allow suffering, but rather, if God doesn't exist, how do we define what is bad?" Murmurs spread through the room. Some students sat up straighter, intrigued by the unexpected shift in perspective. Barron continued, "You see, Professor, when we look at the world and say that something is wrong or evil, we are making a moral judgment. But moral judgments require a moral standard. If we live in a purely materialistic universe, where everything is just atoms and random chance, then where does morality come from? If there is no God, what gives us the authority to declare something as inherently good or evil?" Professor Warren tilted his head slightly. Are you suggesting that without God, we cannot distinguish right from wrong? Barron nodded. Exactly. If morality is merely a human construct, then it is subjective, meaning what is wrong for one society may be perfectly acceptable in another. But deep down, we all know that some things are absolutely wrong, regardless of time or culture. Genocide, child abuse, murder, these acts are not just socially unacceptable, they are universally condemned. But why? If there is no higher moral lawgiver, then why should we believe in any universal morality at all? The professor's fingers tapped against his podium. He had encountered moral arguments for God's existence before. But Barron's approach was strikingly different. It was not an emotional plea, but a logical, reasoned challenge. And what of human progress? Warren countered. Over centuries, societies have developed ethical systems without the need for divine intervention. We created laws, institutions, and philosophies that guide our moral compass. Why must God be involved? Barron's lips curled into a slight smile. Professor? Even the concept of progress assumes a direction. To say that humanity is improving assumes that there is a moral standard we are moving toward. But if morality is relative, then how can we measure progress at all? Without a divine reference point, how do we know whether we are moving forward or simply changing? A hush fell over the room. For the first time, it was the professor who seemed to be on the defensive. The classroom was so silent that one could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The professor, always quick with a sharp rebuttal, found himself momentarily speechless. For the first time, a student had responded in a way that did not merely attempt to defend faith but instead challenged the very foundation of his arguments. He cleared his throat and narrowed his eyes at Barron, determined not to let this young man dictate the flow of the debate. Well, Barron, the professor began, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. You are suggesting that without a divine lawgiver, we would have no objective sense of morality. But haven't we, as humans, created our own moral codes over time? Societies have evolved, formed laws, and established justice systems without the need for divine intervention. Barron remained composed, his expression thoughtful. He took a slow breath before responding. Professor? You are correct that societies create laws and moral systems. However, that does not answer the fundamental question, where does the concept of morality originate? If morality were merely a societal construct, then it would be entirely subjective. That means what is considered good in one society might be evil in another. And neither could claim to be right or wrong in an absolute sense. But deep down, we all recognize certain moral truths as universal, truths that transcend culture, time, and personal preference. The students in the room began shifting in their seats, sensing the depth of the discussion. A girl in the front row raised her hand hesitantly. The professor, perhaps eager for an ally, nodded in her direction. But Barron? She asked, her voice careful. Isn't it possible that morality simply evolved as a survival mechanism? Maybe we developed compassion and a sense of justice because it helped humans cooperate and thrive. Barron nodded, acknowledging her point. That is an argument many have made. And at first glance, it seems reasonable. But let's examine it closely. If morality is merely an evolutionary adaptation, then it serves no higher purpose than ensuring the survival of our species. That would mean that acts of kindness, self-sacrifice, and justice are not truly good in any meaningful sense, they are just biological impulses. Do we really believe that? When we see someone risk their life for a stranger, is that merely an accident of evolution? Or does it point to something greater, something deeper than mere survival instincts? The professor sighed, rubbing his chin as he considered Barron's words. He was not accustomed to being put on the defensive. Yet there was something unsettling about how confidently this young student dismantled his arguments. Let's assume, for a moment, the professor finally said, that there is an absolute moral law. Why does it have to come from a deity? Couldn't it simply be an inherent part of the universe? Like gravity or the laws of physics? Barron smiled, sensing that they were now reaching the heart of the discussion. If morality were simply an inherent part of the universe, then it would be impersonal and indifferent. The law of gravity, for example, does not care whether someone falls off a cliff, it merely acts. But morality is deeply personal. It calls us to love, to forgive, to show mercy. It is not just a set of rules, it is relational. And if it is relational, then it must originate from a being capable of relationship. The classroom remained silent, absorbing the weight of Barron's words. The professor took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. It was evident that he was wrestling with Barron's arguments in a way he had not expected. For years, he had challenged students, dismantling their beliefs with ease. But today, for the first time, he found himself at a loss for a definitive response. The air in the room had shifted. There was no longer the usual sense of superiority in the professor's posture. No trace of the condescension he often carried when debating religious students. Instead, there was a quiet, contemplative energy. The students, too, seemed different, less like passive spectators and more like participants in something significant. The professor finally spoke, his voice softer than before. I must admit, Barron, that your argument is one of the most compelling I have heard in all my years of teaching. But I still struggle with one thing. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Even if we accept that morality must come from a higher being, how do you reconcile that with all the suffering in the world? If this being is truly good, why allow pain, war, and injustice? Barron expected this question. It was, after all, the cornerstone of many debates against the existence of God. He took a moment to respond, ensuring that his words carried both truth and compassion. Professor, suffering is one of the most difficult realities to understand. And I won't pretend to have all the answers. But let's consider something. If God were to remove all suffering instantly, what would happen to human free will? If he prevented every wrong decision, would we still be free to choose between good and evil? The professor frowned but did not interrupt. Without the possibility of evil, Barron continued, goodness would have no meaning. Love would not be love if it were forced. A world without suffering might seem desirable. But it would also be a world without true choice, without personal growth, without the depth of human experience. The greatest acts of courage, compassion, and sacrifice have often been born from suffering. That does not mean suffering is good. But it does suggest that it serves a greater purpose, one we may not always understand in the moment. The professor leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. You are suggesting that suffering is necessary for growth, in many ways? Yes, Barron replied. We see it in our own lives. The hardships we endure shape us. A person who has never faced adversity may never develop resilience. A person who has never lost someone may never fully appreciate love. If we take away all struggle, we take away the very things that make us human. A long silence followed. The professor tapped his fingers on his desk, deep in thought. Finally, he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I still don't believe," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But I respect your reasoning." Barron smiled. "I don't expect to change your mind overnight, Professor. But if today's discussion has given you something to think about, then that's enough." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. But instead of the usual rush of students eager to leave, there was hesitation. They packed their bags slowly, still caught in the gravity of what had just transpired. As Barron gathered his books, a few students approached him, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a young man who had previously scoffed at religious arguments, muttered, "I don't know if I believe in God. But you gave me something to think about." Barron simply nodded. "That's all I hoped for." The professor remained at his desk, watching as the students filed out. He had spent his career challenging faith. Yet today, for the first time, he felt the challenge pressing back on him.